If one guy writing a letter in AD 55 claimed that the risen Christ appeared to 500 people, and that's all the historical evidence we had, I'd be skeptical too. One man's word is not proof, and the skeptics are right to point that out. And so if that's all we have for historical evidence of the risen Christ appearing to groups of people, then we are on rocky historical ground. Fortunately, that's not what we have. Not by a long shot. And so what I want to do in this video is I want to show exactly why Paul's claim that Jesus appeared to 500 people at once is so important and how it fits into the broader historical picture. What we have with group resurrection appearances, the evidence is not just one source. It's not just Paul saying so. It's actually attested to in 7 independent sources. And when you understand how early and how independent these sources are, the evidence goes from being decent to overwhelming. And so the key text for this is 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. Let me put that on the screen real quick. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. That delivered and received is going to be important in a second. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas. Notice Cephas, that's Peter, his Aramaic name, so Cephas, then to the 12. Remember, Judas is dead at this point, so why the 12? Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James. This is Jesus's brother, James. That's important as well. Then to all the apostles. Here's what most people miss about this passage that really the standard New Testament scholar understands. Paul is not just giving his opinion here. He's using specific language. It's actually rabbinic language from the 1st century to explain that he is passing on an official, authoritative tradition, an oral tradition here. And the 2 verbs that he used paralambano and paradidomi. And this is the I received and I passed on. He's using standard language to tell the Corinthians, hey, this was a tradition, an authoritative tradition that I received and passed on to you. Pay attention. And so why is this important? Right out of the gate, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 tells us we don't just have one source. We have 2. We have what Paul is saying. He's affirming this concept that Jesus died, rose, and appeared to people, but also he got the tradition from somewhere. And so wherever he got that tradition from is another source. So then the question is, who did he get the source from? We get a strong clue in Galatians 1:18-19, where Paul talks about how he visited Jerusalem for 15 days and he spent time with Peter, Cephas, and James. Most scholars date Paul's conversion to around 33 to 34 AD, and so that puts this visit to Jerusalem at around 36, 37 AD, something like that. And so just a few years after Jesus' death and resurrection, you have eyewitnesses to those events passing this information on to Paul. And so for one thing, what does this mean? This means that the tradition didn't develop over decades, like a lot of people want to claim. That's not even a popular view in modern New Testament scholarship anymore, because they see that passages like 1 Corinthians 15 and Philippians 2 are far too early. Philippians 2, 5-11 is within 8 to 10 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. And this is within 3 to 5 years of his death and resurrection. This creedal tradition that Paul is quoting here. And so a theological development is virtually impossible. But there's other reasons that scholars say that this passage, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, is a creedal tradition, not just because of the paralambano and paradidomi verbs. So for one thing, Paul uses Cephas instead of Peter. So it's likely that this creedal tradition developed in an Aramaic-speaking Christian community that predates the Gospels, that all started calling Peter Petros, his Greek name. And so they all use Cephas, his Aramaic name, because that's where it developed, in maybe maybe Jerusalem or in Antioch, where there were more Jews and it was Jewish heavy, and so they were speaking Aramaic, and that's where this tradition developed. Second, scholars have studied the style of the words, and they've come to conclude that it really doesn't sound like Paul. It doesn't seem like the way he talks, just in terms of style, but then 3, also in terms of theology. It's not the normal way that he articulates certain theological points. And so for these reasons, and then even for the fourth reason, the mentioning of the 12, like I mentioned earlier, Judas is already dead at this point. And Matthew and Luke are explicit about saying the 11 after Judas is already gone. And then Acts goes to great lengths to try and make sure that that 12th position is filled by Matthias. So this is already strange that Paul would use the 12. He's using the 12 not in an embarrassing way, with no caveats, with no disclaimers or anything. He's just using the 12 because that's the tradition that was received for him. And it's even more telling that Paul never uses the word the 12 to talk about the disciples of Jesus anywhere else in all of his works. This is the only place. And so the most likely conclusion is the same conclusion that you can come to with the use of Peter's Aramaic name. Because this symbolic number 12 was so important to the Jewish people and to understanding the encompassing all of Israel, that this tradition most likely developed in an Aramaic Jewish heavy context where they were using 12 to talk about Israel. And second, the 12 is a category rooted in Jesus's pre-Easter ministry. Like this was an eschatologically loaded term. This idea of the 12, where the Jewish expectation was that the Messiah would come and he would restore all of Israel, which is the 12 tribes of Israel. And so using this term is loaded with eschatology. And so we would expect this sort of tradition to develop in an Aramaic speaking Jewish community, not in a Gentile community, or not just Paul writing it when it's not actually accurate to the historical event. It's a symbolic and eschatologically loaded term more than it is just, oh, there were 12 people. It's talking about the 12 as they were in Jesus's pre-Easter ministry, and that has eschatological symbolic meaning. So to put it all together, using the 12 does not fit the post-resurrection data where there's only 11 until Matthias. And again, 1 Corinthians is written before Acts. It doesn't fit Paul's vocabulary. And like I just said, it doesn't fit the conventions of Matthew, Luke, or Acts. And so for these reasons, scholars say, hey, this is not coming from Paul directly. This is what we say pre-formed tradition. And don't just believe me. This is not just me saying this. This is Gerhard Ludemann, one of the main scholars in the Jesus Seminar, who's saying this. Bart Ehrman says this. Like many secular and skeptical scholars of New Testament studies are also affirming that this is a pre-formed tradition. This is not just conservative scholars waving their Bible flag saying, hey guys, look, we think this is earlier than Paul. Everyone's agreeing on this. Okay, so that's one aspect, is we have this. That's the core text of what we're discussing today, is the 500 eyewitnesses. But the reason it goes beyond this is because you have 7 independent sources saying that Jesus appeared to groups. Again, if it were just Paul and just this preformed tradition, we still can't really know. It's like, oh, it seems like a strong historical argument, but you really can't know because it's just one dude saying it. But we have 6 other independent sources who are attesting to the same concept that Jesus appeared to groups. And then once you have all of this historical data, then you have to ask, well, what's the most likely cause of these 7 independent streams all reporting the same thing? Like they did not collude with one another, right? They did not plan ahead and say, hey, you write it this way, you write it that way. That's why scholars call them independent sources. They're truly independent of one another. How many times can I say independent? It's just that important that most people think when I say independent, I don't actually mean independent. These sources, these 6 other sources that I'm about to talk about, did not read 1 Corinthians 15 when they made these comments, did not read each other when they made these comments. These are 7 independent streams of evidence that all point to the same conclusion. So the next one is Mark. Mark is the earliest of the Gospels. It was written roughly in 60 something AD. And the important points to make here is that in Mark, it's reported that Jesus predicts his own death 3 times. Then the empty tomb is seen by the women, and the angel predicts that Jesus will appear in Galilee. And so you're looking forward to these resurrection appearances to groups. So Mark very clearly, by the way that he articulates the end of his gospel, even though people want to make a big deal out of, oh, Jesus never actually shows up at the end of Mark. It's clear that Mark is saying by these predictions, hey, this is exactly what happened. We're just not finishing the story for, his rhetorical reasons that scholars debate about why he ended his gospel that way. But that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is just to say Mark is clearly anticipating group appearances, which means he knew that tradition. And this is an independent attestation of that Galilean group appearance. Next, you have Luke's unique material. So scholars take the unique material from Luke, the unique material from Matthew that don't appear in Mark or John or any of their early sources. We have a very interesting group appearance where Jesus appears to two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And this is not reported anywhere else, but it has all the same marks of these group appearance concepts where they don't recognize him until they break bread together and then he disappears and then they run back to Jerusalem. It's a great story. But this is another independent source saying that Jesus appeared to groups of disciples. Now, Matthew's special material called M also has the Great Commission, right? So when Jesus is about to ascend into heaven, he says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I have commanded, and behold, I am with you to the end of the age." That is unique to Matthew. That doesn't show up in any other gospel or in Paul. It's unique to Matthew, and it's another independent stream attesting to Jesus's appearance to groups. You have the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John has 3 separate group appearances, all of which are independent of any other gospel or early source. You've got first when Jesus appears in the locked room to the disciples where Thomas is not there. Then a week later, you have Jesus appear again where Thomas is there. And then lastly, you have by the Sea of Galilee in chapter 21, where he appears to, I think, 7 of the disciples. And so his vocabulary is very different. His theological emphases are very different that show that John is not borrowing from the synoptic gospels and he's not borrowing from Paul. This is his own unique strand of testimony. And I personally believe the Gospel of John is an eyewitness testimony, and there's strong evidence for that, but I don't have time to make that argument in this video. Regardless of that, whether you land on eyewitness testimony or not, it is independent. Most scholars affirm that John's testimony is independent of these other New Testament sources. So that's not really debatable. And then source 6, you have Acts. And this isn't the Luke-Acts combo, which we can get back to in a second, but this is actually what we call the pre-Lukan kerygmatic formulas. So the kerygma, it's a fancy scholarly word that comes from a Greek term that means to I proclaim. And all it's saying is what was the core teaching of the early church before the New Testament was written down? Well, scholars believe that really the Acts sermon summaries get back to the core teaching of early Christianity before the Gospels and Acts and some of the historical books of the New Testament were written down. And so there's the pattern, especially in Peter's sermon at Pentecost and some of these other early sermon summaries, you have basically 3 parts. Jesus was crucified, God raised him, and we are witnesses to these things. And the disciples are witnessing together about this event, saying, "Hey, Jesus appeared to us." So it's a little bit weaker, I will say. It's a little bit weaker of an argument that people could say, "Oh, well, the disciples were just saying, oh, Jesus appeared to each one of us individually," when they say we, and not necessarily they all had a group appearance together. But this is the group of disciples all witnessing to the resurrection of Jesus together at once. So to me, it's still quite strong evidence that they not only believe that Jesus appeared to each of them individually, but they were like, "Hey, Jesus appeared to all of us, and we're all witnessing to that fact together." So I think it still belongs in the independent source list for group appearances. And then lastly, you do have a few more instances in Luke Acts that are independent of his sources that he used. So independent of L and independent of his pre-Lukan kerygmatic sermon summaries. You have when the disciples are in Jerusalem and Jesus eats fish in front of them. And then you have the post-resurrection teaching in Acts 1. That's the extended teaching right before the ascension. So both of those are independent of any other source, and they are coming from the author of Luke Acts, aka Luke, directly. And so just take a step back and look at that cumulative picture. We've got 7 sources. We have the pre-Pauline tradition, which is really it's 8. I miscounted but we'll go 7 and you'll see what I mean. 1, we have Paul's preformed tradition. In 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, we have his own testimony of when he talks about how the risen Christ appeared to him on the road to Damascus. That's source 2. We have Mark that independently attests through Jesus's death and resurrection predictions, and then the empty tomb and the prediction that he will appear in Galilee. Then we have the independent material of Luke on the road to Emmaus. Then we have the independent material of Matthew, which is the Great Commission. We have John with those 3 group appearances. We have the early Acts sermon summaries. And then 8 if you include this Luke-Acts narrative flow that Luke wrote as its own independent source, different from both L and the early sermon summaries in Acts. You've got 8. So we have 7, maybe 8, depending on how you count them, independent sources that say Jesus appeared to groups of disciples in his post-resurrected body. Here's why that's so important. When historians are doing historical research on any topic, especially in ancient historiography, if you have 2 independent streams that witness to the same event, it's pretty much considered practical fact. You can't know anything with absolute certainty, but the bar is already there. The bar is set that if you have multiple streams that are saying the same thing about an event, it probably happened, and we can be confident enough that it did happen. Jesus has 7 or 8, and this is just for his group appearances. This isn't for all the other facts about his life, death, and resurrection. I'm just talking about exclusively the group appearances. If you bring in individual appearances, if you bring in early church fathers, or if we start talking about eyewitness testimony and how the Gospels really look like eyewitness testimony, the historical weight of the argument for Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, that he existed, that he did what he said he did, or that he did what the gospel said he did, that he preached what they said he preached, and that he really died and he really rose, the historical weight of that evidence is honestly astounding when you see it, how well his entire life is multiply attested. And so that goes back to our original question. Did Paul just make up this idea of 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection, to the resurrected Christ? If that's all the evidence we had, I would be totally okay if people just blew it off and said, of course he made that up. But that's not what we have. We have so many different people saying the same thing, that Jesus in his resurrected state appeared to people in groups in order to affirm his resurrection, teach them certain things, and then ascend to heaven, saying, hey, I will be with you always to the end of the age, and sending his spirit. That's multiply attested. That's not just one person saying it. And so when people say, hey, didn't Paul just make up this idea of 500 eyewitnesses? It's very unlikely. It's based on all the evidence. It's extremely unlikely that he just made it up. So then if he didn't just make it up, what are the alternative hypotheses? Well, some people want to say, well, it was group hallucinations. But in psychology, they have done study after study that has shown that there has never been a documented case ever of anyone having shared dreams or hallucinations. It would be amazing if me and my wife could link up on dreams and say, hey, let's go to the beach for vacation, but let's do it on the cheap. So let's just share a dream and we can be sitting by the beach together. That doesn't exist. It doesn't happen. It's the same thing with hallucinations. There's not a single documented instance where people have had a hallucination of the exact same thing. And so that explanation just falls short. What about the theological development route? Like this developed over 10 years of them preaching the gospel, and then they all just kind of came to this consensus like, yeah, actually, I do think Jesus appeared to me too. Oh yeah, I do remember that. It's far too early. That development takes time. But 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is right up to within a year or two of when Jesus died and rose. And so this development angle, it's just too fast. It couldn't have developed in that amount of time. And so we're left really with one simple conclusion. The risen Jesus actually appeared to his disciples when they were in groups. That's the only explanation that makes sense of all the historical data and why so many independent sources are reporting the same thing. That's the only one that makes sense. Did Paul make up the idea that Jesus appeared to 500 people post-Easter? No, I don't think so. I think the evidence is too strong to make that claim. And the other alternative hypotheses to explain these group appearances just fall short. In fact, I would argue that the group appearances of Jesus' resurrection is among the best historically attested evidence of anything about Jesus' life that we have. And not just that, but the alternative explanations that try to explain away how the disciples could think that Jesus appeared to them in groups without it actually happening are the weakest of any alternative explanations. And so this right here, the idea that there's historical evidence that Jesus in his post-resurrected state appeared to the disciples and appeared to people in groups is among the strongest arguments that I think that the resurrection actually happened, period. But what's interesting is the resurrection and the group appearances, they're not the only things that we can use standard historical method to prove actually happen. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how actually every major aspect of Jesus's life, including his death and resurrection, can be proved using standard historical method. And so in the next video, I'm going to go through those 10 or 12, I'll have to go look back at my research notes, but 10 to 12 events that every scholar, whether secular or Christian, skeptical, whatever, they agree to these 12 events, that this is who the historic Jesus was. And then my question then is the historical Jesus any different than the Christ of faith? Because since the Jesus Seminar, and even before that in 20th century liberal theology, since Rudolf Bultmann, they've tried to divide the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith and say, this Jesus of history was one man, but then the Christ of faith was a later invention by the church. And actually using standard historical method, you can show that the Christ of faith is the Jesus of history, that you just shorten that gap immediately from Christians believed this about Jesus. It's like, no, Jesus taught this about himself. The earliest kerygma of the early church, going back to the Acts sermon summaries and things like that, is that Jesus was Lord and that he rose. And that makes the core of the proclamation. And from that, and reading Paul and all this kind of things, you can extrapolate the Christ of faith from the earliest moments of the Christian movement. And so there is no gap between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And so I'm going to show that in the next video more holistically. This was focused on the group appearances of the resurrection and Paul's claim that Jesus appeared to 500. And basically he was hinting at the fact that, hey, you Corinthians, you can go ask them. A lot of them are still alive. You can go find them and ask them yourself, including Cephas and James and the 12. Like he's very clear that there were eyewitnesses and you can go ask them. And it wasn't just something he made up. It is multiply attested. One of the best evidences for the resurrection there is. And I think it needs to be treated appropriately, not just in the scholarly fields, but also on YouTube and in the public discourse where people aren't talking about some of these minute details as much. I just think we would do better to engage more in some of this scholarly discussions to get really at the meat of the issue instead of just going back and forth. So hopefully this is helpful to some people. If you're a Christian and you're watching this, consider sharing this with a friend who maybe struggles with this. Maybe it's a Christian friend or a non-Christian friend who's got questions. I hope this was helpful. And if it was, I'll see you in the next one. If it wasn't, no worries. There's a lot of other videos, a lot of other good people making YouTube videos, so you can go watch them. All right. See you in the next one. Peace.